Okay. So I've been away for a while. I'm going to actually give the third presentation that I gave in Bogota. Due to some unforeseen issues, I had some trouble actually getting through this the way I wanted to. So I thought I would actually just redo the presentation for all of you, because I think the content is actually pretty good. But I guess I'll just simply start with a recap of what's kind of been going on. So as far as on my end, I did some moving, so it's been a little busy over here. But I'm also going to not be doing these as much because I have some other things that I'm working on, which you will find out about later. So the big thing for me right now is I'm going to make sure that if I do any of these videos or podcasts or whatever you want to call them, they'll just be high quality information, and that's about it. And then there's some other stuff that will be going on. But for me, I went to Bogota. I gave 3 presentations, which was pretty, I mean, the atmosphere was great. It was awesome getting to just have a high quality, intelligent conversations with people that aren't dumb, which is hard to find in this space, I feel like. And it was cool. I mean, I got to go see, I got to go to the Council of Bogota, which is like a government building. I got fingerprinted as I walked in, and then they actually ended up, recognizing Craig as Satoshi Nakamoto with this, not a plaque, but some kind of certificate. It was just really interesting. It was just, he was pretty much a celebrity everywhere we went, and so the whole thing was just really, really cool to see. And then as far as the Colombian people, so they actually had so I gave 3 presentations. 2 of them went well. I don't know which third one didn't go well. I know that this one that I'm about to give you, there was a lot of miscommunication about the slides. Part of that was my fault. So I started to wing it at the beginning, and then I kind of was just flustered. And then also, in Colombia, no one speaks English. And so this presentation, I don't think was appropriate. I think I was trying to do too much with this presentation, but I already put it together. So I thought, why not just give it? And so with all of that said, I guess if I had to report back about my experience in Colombia with regards to like cryptocurrency and Bitcoin, was that they need this. Not only do they need Bitcoin, but they need Bitcoin SV more than anything, because pretty much everyone we ran into was trying to sell some kind of token, right? Which is the same thing we see here in the United States. But what I found most interesting was that it was just basically very little actual thought going into any of this stuff. It was just, well, it's a token. And there's a chance, there's like a non-zero chance that I'm in a video with like someone promoting an ICO in Spanish. Like, I have no idea. There were so many people that just started speaking Spanish with me in the frame, and I'm pretty sure like one of them at least was just selling an ICO with my face attached to it, even though they probably didn't know my face. It was just a weird experience, but it was great. It was awesome. I really enjoyed doing it, and I would like to thank, definitely the people at the Bitcoin Association, but also Boris from Bitech down there, because he had put it all together. So it was just a really great experience. And so, so I guess what else? I mean, I guess the other thing that really resonated with people. So actually, Craig, if you haven't watched it yet, it's already up. It's Craig gave the speech. He gave by far the best speech I've ever seen him give, and it was really. The first presentation he gave was on R puzzles, and I think everyone was like looking forward to watching him present, and then I think the translator couldn't even keep up with what he was talking about. So that was pretty funny, and I think he realized maybe this isn't the audience for what I'm doing here, and he came back and pretty much just spoke off the cuff about why he created Bitcoin, for the South American world, essentially. Why was it important to Colombia? It was fantastic. So I highly recommend watching that, but you could tell resonated a lot with all these people was two things. Number one, as far as Bitcoin SV goes, it's stability, right? And this was a main focus in, especially my first presentation, which when you do see that, you'll kind of understand what I'm talking about. But I call Bitcoin SV the free and open Bitcoin. And that's really important for two reasons, right? As far as like being free and open, it means that anyone can build things. It means that anyone can build an assortment of things. And that's really good because it allows just unlimited potential. You know, you're not restricted in how you use Bitcoin, and then developers aren't restricted in how they build applications on top of Bitcoin. But the other thing is if I want to maximize freedom is having money outside of centralized control. Okay? So there's only one Bitcoin that actually removes the power of money from centralized control, and that's Bitcoin SV, because they've actually committed to locking down the protocol. Every other cryptocurrency has, they're proud of the fact that they aren't locking the protocol, right? And so why is this important? Well, it's quite simple, because if you remember Satoshi Nakamoto, and this is actually ironic, I found this the most ironic part of Chris Pacey wrote this article, and I shared it. But he actually took Satoshi's quote about how Bitcoin removes, the problem with conventional currency is that it requires trust, essentially, and it requires trust that the central authority won't debase the currency, right? Well, if that's what Bitcoin was trying to solve, then Ethereum and Bitcoin Cash and Bitcoin Core and all these other ones, they haven't really solved that problem. They've actually just taken control from one central authority and given it to another. In the case of Bitcoin Cash, that's the Bitcoin ABC developers. And in the case of Bitcoin Core, it's the Bitcoin Core developers. And if you remember, Frederick Hayek, the quote that everyone loves to spit around from him is, "I don't believe we should ever have good money again until we take the thing out of the hands of government." And then he says, well, we can't do that violently. We have to do it in a sly, roundabout way that they can't stop it. Well, Frederick Hayek didn't envision the cryptocurrency world, because we did take the thing out of the hands of government, and we ended up with just hundreds of cryptocurrencies. And 99% of them have, it just took one central authority and replaced it with another. Only in some ways it's scarier what it's replaced it with, because it's just replaced it with developers that aren't accountable to anybody, that can just do whatever the hell they want. So I'll leave that. I mean, I talked about that pretty extensively in the other presentations. They'll be up at some point. You can watch them. But that's what really resonated with the Colombian people, was really, for them, just as, Venezuela and all that kind of stuff. I mean, they have to worry about their currency being debased. And in Bitcoin SV, it's because it's Bitcoin, because this is the whole point that Bitcoin is trying to solve. They don't have to worry about that anymore. And that really resonated with a lot of people. And for a lot of people, they hadn't even really thought about it. It really hadn't even crossed their mind to think about it that way. All right, so I'm going to give this presentation right now. Again, this was also recorded, but I can't remember how it went. I was kind of flustered at the beginning of the presentation, and I kind of just cycled through it quickly. But so I'm just going to pretend like I'm presenting it to you. I actually haven't looked at it since I made it a while ago or gave it, so I might stumble a little bit, but it should be okay here. So let's see. Let me try and make sure I actually present it to that screen. Nope. This is embarrassing. All right, well, I'm just going to just do it here. You can see this. So that's fine, right? Okay, so it's a small world after all. You all know who I am, and I gave 3 talks. But, what am I going to show you today? So I'm going to actually help us logically deduce the network topology of Bitcoin just from first principles. And what I mean by that is, so we actually don't need mathematics. This is very important. We don't need mathematics to understand this. And so everyone that still, because they just hate Craig Wright, they're still not, they mock this idea of a small world network. I'm actually going to show you how you can just very logically deduce this by yourself. And anyone who denies it is just, they're just idiots. They just don't even accept basic logic, okay? So we're going to ask that question, is he right? Is it a small world network? And then lastly, we'll just examine what this means on a global scale, right? As we make Bitcoin into the internet of the world. So we're going to talk about three things mainly, okay? So networks have three primary characteristics, which are robustness, search, and diffusion. Okay? So what does that mean? Well, robustness is basically just how resilient are you to an attack, okay? So in the case of Bitcoin, the Bitcoin network itself is robust from attack because if a miner is removed from the system, it still works, right? So this is what everyone loves to, they really get off to this idea of decentralization. Well, okay, what is decentralization? Well, it's this, right? It's basically the idea that the network isn't, it's not capable of being attacked at a central place. And this is actually really important because Bitcoin is more resilient than most distributed systems. So in the case of something like the Lightning Network, well, you can call that decentralized, but there are single points of failure, right? So I can take down large node operators or channel operators or whatever, and then while you might have a distributed system, the actual network would cease to function by removing one node in that network more so than it would in Bitcoin, because in Bitcoin you remove a miner, it might take a little longer to find the next block, but it works out. And then also the difficulty adjusts. So search. So we have robustness, search, and diffusion. Well, search is basically the procedure by which nodes can look for and access information inside of the network. Okay? So in Bitcoin, we can actually think of this very simply as I want to find a transaction let's say I want to find a transaction in the mempool. Well, how easy is it for me as some random node in the network to do that? Okay? And this could also be like, a block has been found. How easy is it for me to find out that has happened? Okay. And then diffusion is kind of the opposite of that, where how can something spread across the network? Where diffusion is basically, a block has been found by myself, but now I want to make sure I spread that to the rest of the network. Diffusion is basically that phenomenon where we examine how is that going to spread across the network. All right, so we need to ask ourselves, so what is a small world network? It was first coined by Stanley Milgram, and the experiment itself the original experiment was called the Small World Experiment, and it was conducted by Milgram to basically just wanted to find out what is the average path length, or basically what is the degree of separation from one person in the United States social network to another. And then I took this quote because this is pretty accurately says it. It describes a situation where, despite facing a very large population, an individual can typically succeed in contacting any other in the population through a short path of intermediaries. Okay? So Milgram's experiments, you can see here, this is the general concept. So I have a letter, and I want to get it from middle of America, so either like Nebraska or Kansas, and I say, okay, well, I need to get to Boston. Okay? A specific person in Boston. And the rules are that if you get the letter and you don't know the person who you're sending the letter to, you need to send it to the next person you think would be able to get it to the person in Boston. So in some cases in Milgram's experiment, the letter did get there. In some cases it didn't get there. But what he found was that if it did reach the final destination, it took on average 6 hops to get there. And this was actually pretty wild at the time. And basically, what's really important to understand is searchability. This idea of searchability in a network was key to his experiment because he found that, how easily can someone search through the United States social network to find what they need to do to perform the task, right? And most importantly, it comes down to incentives. So what is the incentive for me to get it to Boston very quickly? Well, in Milgram's case, they were promised a prize, right? So the idea being, okay, well, I really want to do this, so I'm going to really I'm going to be very careful about who I pass this letter to, because I really want this to get there in as short of a time as possible. So he found that so when people were validating his experiment, they identified specifically the importance of individual incentives in the formation of a small world network. So I hope your brain is already kind of turning here, right? Because you're probably starting to think, well, okay, if incentives are important in the formation of a small network, well, What's the most incentive-driven network that we all know of, even if you are an idiot about Bitcoin? All right, so this is where I guess taking one step back, this is where the idea of 6 degrees of separation comes from, right? So you hear this all the time with like 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon and all this other kind of stuff, right? This is where all of this came from. And you are connected just to anybody with 6 degrees of separation. But what's actually really interesting is that a study was done just on Facebook. So this doesn't include any other social networks. But in Facebook's case, they found that actually people were separated by an average degree of separation of 3.57. So almost cut in half from Milgram's experiment just from technology. So technology is actually more densely connecting us, which is quite interesting, right? Because it shows you how, okay, well, you can start understanding how social networks, with respect to technology, are lowering this median path length. So, well, how do we get a smaller network? Mathematically, how do we get there from a regular network, okay? And if you can think of a regular network as this network on the left, okay? So the network on the left is pretty straightforward. It's basically, think of a straight line. So actually get rid of this circle for 1 second. Think of just a straight line where all of these dots are just spread out in a straight line. A regular network would just be that each dot is connected to its neighbor. And you can kind of see this here. So they're connected not only to the neighbor, but the neighbor next to it. So it's a little different, but the concept remains the same. But we have this variable called P, right? So this P variable is a randomness variable. And what this just means is that as we increase that variable from 0 to 1, or we increase the randomness of the network, we start to get the formation of a small world network, where you can get from one side of the circle to another in a small number of hops. And if we go all the way to 1, we end up with a random network, right? So maybe sit here and think about this for a little bit, but we're just using logical reasoning here. We don't actually need any mathematics. And just think about this. If I'm a miner in the network, what is the incentive to be densely connected? What is the incentive to rewire my connections so that I'm not just connected to my geographical neighbors? Well, let's think this through. So if I'm a miner, if I find a block, let's say I find a block, but someone else finds a block at the exact same time. The only way my block is going to get built on is if I announce it to the rest of the network first, right? So, so there's an incentive already. All right, well, I should be better connected to my neighbors and my peers than that guy. Because if I am better connected, then I win the race. All right, so that's a good example. Let's see. Another perfect example would be, well, I don't want to include a double spend transaction inside of my block because I don't want it to be orphaned by other miners. All right, well, then I better be densely connected to all the other mempools in the network so that I can scan other mempools and make sure that I am not including a double spend transaction in a block. All right, so we have incentives. So actually P can just be thought of, this variable P, just think of it as the incentive to be densely connected. And this is pretty much what I spelled out here. All that is just the incentive for miners to connect to all other miners. And I kind of spelled out, what this is here for you. What is that incentive? Well, it's very high in Bitcoin. So this is something you might have seen before, but this is actually what happens. So if I'm a miner, over time I start rewiring myself. I start making sure, well, I'm not only going to connect to 8 peers, I'm going to up that. I'm going to connect to 20 peers. Oh, well, look at that. I'm going to connect to 100 peers. And maybe at some point you just realize, you know what? I'm just going to connect to every single thing in this network that I possibly can. Because there's a direct incentive for me to do so, right? So as we look at the network, it begins to take shape. We can actually see it rewires itself to become very, 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 very densely connected. So I'll move on. And I guess let me just back before we even get into these cool little graphics. We've already done this. We've already proven this correctly. Bitcoin has to be a small world network because there's a direct incentive to build the small world network. So this is what I'm talking about. So any person that has ever told you that the small world network claim is stupid and blah, 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 these people are idiots. And I don't say that lightly. They're just people who don't actually even look They don't do research. They don't actually think about this stuff. They literally are just idiots, and they parrot stupid things. And they might be smart in other things, but they don't understand Bitcoin, and they don't want to understand Bitcoin. So that's my little soapbox for the minute there. So as I mentioned, we've just logically proven that Bitcoin is a small world network. So how does this actually affect? So this is the more remarkable thing. I mean, this is a model of Bitcoin right here. So you can actually, so I find a block. Look at how quickly the rest of the network finds it or knows, right? And this was a graphic originally. You can understand, well, if I'm a Raspberry Pi in the network, what is my incentive? I don't have an incentive to be densely connected. What is the point? I mean, there's no incentive for me to connect to every peer possible. I don't care when the block gets to me. As long as it gets to me. I don't care if my transaction gets to every other miner. I just care if it gets to someone, right? So, all right. This is where I go on my soapbox for the presentation. We find out that it's a small world after all, right? So just by thinking of the incentive scheme, we can deduce the topology quite easily. And I asked the question, why did this take us so long? It's quite simple why it took so long. No one was thinking about it except for Craig Wright. And he actually then proved it along with Marco Havarone in July of 2018, where they wrote a paper called From Bitcoin to Bitcoin Cash, a Network Analysis, and actually showed that the network distance in Bitcoin is 1.3, which is remarkable. So you have to start realizing, so Facebook, a very, popular social network, only got us down to 3.5. So now we have a network that gets us down to 1.3. All right? Fantastic. So, if you remember, we started from the beginning. Networks have three primary characteristics: robustness, search, and diffusion. So we're going to look at these three properties just with Bitcoin. Well, as I mentioned earlier, can I shut down Bitcoin? No, because even if I have 100 miners and I remove 90, the network still operates, which is remarkable. So the robustness is very high. And this is where, Craig, when he gave his presentation at the Satoshi Vision Conference, actually, he said specifically, this is a network DARPA wished that they had created. Okay? So if you think about that quite a bit, it's pretty fantastic. But they didn't create it. And compare and contrast this with the Lightning Network. As I mentioned, if you take down one of those central hubs, the network ceases to function. So search, if we have a network distance of 1.3, then let's think about this. All right, so if I want to search the network for something, I want to search the network for a transaction. This means I only have to go either to one peer or theoretically another peer, if I didn't get a miner immediately, to find that transaction. So wow, that's remarkable. Okay, and obviously we already understand the incentive for searchability is high. Okay, merchants, not only do miners want to know if a block has been found or if they're including double spend transactions, but they want to know if they're receiving a double spent transaction. If I'm a merchant, I'm incentivized to search the network, right? Because if I'm the merchant, I want to make sure someone didn't come in and defraud me. And this is quite simple. This is actually what the vending machine snack thread was in Bitcoin Talk, where Satoshi explained this. So there's something you have to understand, is that Bitcoin is multidimensional, right? And so what do I mean by multidimensional? It means that nodes in the network are not equal. So this is something that the Bitcoin core people don't understand, because they want all of the nodes in the network to be equal. They actually want the people at home to validate blocks and to validate transactions, which is absurd. And in fact, the original white paper spells it out pretty clearly that the nodes aren't equal. So you can actually think of nodes as a hierarchy, okay? Miners at the center, merchants and businesses in the middle, and then users on the outside, okay? So quite simple, but make sure you understand this. It's a hierarchy, okay? So why is this important? Well, because if we think about searchability in a network, a hierarchical network makes the network more searchable. And specifically, nodes are going to look up the hierarchy for information. And as I just mentioned, if I'm a user, I send a transaction to a merchant. I don't care if it gets to a miner, right? I don't care if the merchant gets paid. The merchant is incentivized to broadcast that transaction as rapidly as possible. And merchants are also incentivized to search the network for double spend transactions. So why did I mention that it's hierarchical? Well, because if you actually study graph theory, you find out something interesting, which is a multidimensional network. The search delay grows logarithmically as opposed to linearly with a mesh network. So in the case of Lightning, as the network grows, the search delay of the network grows linearly. In Bitcoin, it's this red line down here. It's logarithmic. So actually, the network can scale very large, and you only slightly increase the search delay. So this is important because if I want to build a new network, which we're going to give a real-life example of this at the very end, having a logarithmic growth of search delay is very important because you want to maintain that low factor of searchability, or the high searchability property. And so lastly, diffusion. So we actually find out that Bitcoin's diffusion models in an epidemiology model called SEIRC. So what does SEIRC stand for? Susceptible, exposed, infected, recovery, and carrier. So I'm gonna help you understand this quite easily. So what does susceptible mean? Okay. Well, this is pretty straightforward. So if I'm a miner, I'm going to be susceptible to any new thing that happens in the network, specifically any new transactions or any blocks that are propagated across the network. In the case of a transaction, if I think the transaction is valid, I immediately add it to my mempool, and if I don't, I reject it. If a block is propagated, I'm highly susceptible to that because I want to make sure that I'm not wasting time. Because if I waste time hashing when a block has already been found, then we got problems. I'm losing money. Okay? So next, exposed. What is exposed? Well, that's pretty simple. It just means that you are, you've been exposed to that block, or you've been exposed to that transaction. So all these properties apply to both transactions and blocks. So in the case of a miner, okay, I've found a block, or I've received a block that someone else has mined. I'm now going to determine whether or not it's a valid block, and I'm going to mine on top of it. So this is a very short process, but I say, okay, I've received a block. I'm going to determine whether or not I accept the block as valid. This is Nakamoto consensus, if you remember, and I'm going to build on top of the block. So similarly, this happens with transactions, right? I decide whether or not a transaction is valid, and that's when, as soon as I see it, I decide to put it into my mempool or not. And this is what infected means. I've decided the block is valid, and I've begun mining on top of it. Or I decide the transaction is valid and I include it in my mempool. And basically, this infection spreads across the network. So you can think of, well, why does it model an epidemic, or why is it similar to an epidemic model? Well, it's quite simple. You can think of this just as an infection, and it spreads across the network very rapidly because the network is so densely connected, just like human beings, right? And then we have recovery. So this means that you return to a state of susceptibility. So if I'm a miner, I've determined that the block is valid. I've mined on top of the block, and now I begin hashing again. And I'm awaiting either to find a block or for someone else to send me a block. And then transactions, of course, are the same thing. And then finally, also, what is this carrier? Well, the carriers are actually in Bitcoin non-mining nodes. They carry the virus, which in this case are blocks and transactions, but they may not necessarily spread that virus. Well, why don't they spread the virus? There's no incentive to do so. Quite simple. Wow. So this is remarkable. We have a biologically inspired network. I mean, this is remarkable. This is what I will give a shout out to Alex Agate. I'm sorry, Alex. I still don't know how to pronounce your last name. From Handcash. And he put something out when Libra came out. And I was like, thank God someone gets it. He said, if you're still thinking about the coin, but not the network, then you're misunderstanding Bitcoin. You don't understand the power of Bitcoin. Because it's not just about a coin. It's a completely different type of network because there's a coin. This is what people aren't getting. So when people ask me, why aren't you scared of Libra? Why aren't you scared of shitcoin? Why aren't you scared of insert random cryptocurrency. And this goes for the other two Bitcoin forks. They don't understand this. The Bitcoin Cash people don't understand this. In fact, they don't want this network to become what it is. They want to make an entirely different type of network. This is why they want to centrally plan the system. If you change the incentive scheme, you don't end up with this kind of stuff. You don't end up with the same incentive model. And then, of course, the Bitcoin Core people are just, I mean, they're so far removed from understanding this. It's remarkable. So let's now take this one step further, and we're going to get to the last part of this presentation is, okay, well, we have this network. So now what happens if we do this Metanet thing? What happens if we actually encompass the internet inside of Bitcoin? So there's a type of network that you've probably heard some people talk about. It's called a Mandela Network. Okay. Now, actually, the ironic thing, because again, so people are going to see this and you're like, well, you're just parroting stuff that you don't understand. This this Mandela Network, I actually first heard about this when I was in London, and Alex Fovel, I'll give him a shout out, Second Entropy on Twitter. We were out drinking, and he was like, he was like he had already figured this out. He was like, okay, so if I want the internet encompassed inside of Bitcoin, here's what it would look like. This is actually a very newly studied topic. If you search Mandela Network, the research on this is pretty new. And I read the paper on it, and I was just blown away. I was like, of course this is what the internet would look like. This makes so much sense. And then, of course, the next day is when Craig unveils the Metanet, and he says the word Mandela Network. I was like, well, this is interesting. So this shouldn't be surprising to you, though, because we've already kind of gone over this. You can see in the direct center, we have the miners, and then we have the merchants and businesses, and then we have the users. So I spell this out pretty clearly. You start with the users. Who are the users? They're the people on the outside. They don't care about being densely connected. They don't really care about the blockchain, really. They just want to interact with the network, right? Then we have businesses. We have merchants, businesses, these kinds of things that make up the middle of the network that are densely connected to the center of the network. But they're also there for users to interact with. They provide those interactions for users. You can think of this actually in Bitcoin SV already as things like Bitstagram, things like Money Button, right? So these are just applications that are facilitating your use of the blockchain. And there's a direct incentive for them to be densely connected to the central layer, which is the miners. Okay? Very straightforward. Very, very, very straightforward. So this is a Mandela network. Okay? And this is the Metanet. And it's highly robust. It's highly searchable. It's all held together by incentives. And one thing I want to pretty much reiterate to you is that why is this important? Because we've only built this network because we have a way to have payments. And because we have a way to have payments, we have ways to incentivize this new network. So if all of the information in a network is free, you don't actually have information, you have data. So information is actually data that has value, right? So I'm going to show you an example of how we can solve the problems that are inherent to the internet today. So I call this the BitTorrent problem. This is why you're never going to solve this problem with BitTorrent. Okay? So I love South Park. I love the two guys who created South Park. And there's this video where they actually taught a class at NYU. Okay? And I just think they're fantastic writers. And I really want to see this whole thing. I want to see the whole clip of them. There's a little tiny 2-minute clip on YouTube. But all of the websites that hosted this video are down. You can't actually find this video anywhere. It's not on every archive of the website, doesn't hold the video. You can't watch this video. It's impossible. You can watch this 2-minute clip of the video, but you can't find the actual appearance of them on this show. So what do I do when I can't find a video? Well, I try to torrent it. Okay. So what is a torrent? Well, a torrent is just a mesh network, right? A torrenting network is just a mesh network, where basically all the computers in the network, you can think of this, maybe all of the green, ignore the labeling here, but just think about, in my example here, maybe the green computers here are the seeders and the reds are the leechers, right? So if you ever use a torrent, you understand this concept of, okay, well, if I want to download a file, someone has to be seeding the file for me. And the inherent problem of torrents is that there's actually no incentive to seed files. In fact, there's a disincentive in most cases because most torrents are illegal files. So if I'm seeding an illegal file, I could get in trouble, right? So the incentive model of BitTorrent is completely broken. But this isn't just the BitTorrent problem. This is the internet problem. The only way that there's actually incentive to host stuff is by using ads, because then I can actually get paid to host the data, right? So in this case, I want to find this video. Okay, well, so here I am. This is where I am in the network of the internet. And I say, all right, I want to find this video. And let's just say, hypothetically, I can figure out, check it out. Someone's got the video. Here he is. All right. Fantastic. I want to download this video. But wait. The only person that he was sharing the file with, let's just say hypothetically in this example, their computer turns off. Voila. I can no longer access this file. This is a big problem. This is a problem that everyone runs into if you torrent anything. There's no incentive for this file to be distributed across the network. And this is what other cryptocurrencies are trying to solve. They won't solve the problem. Because the only way to actually solve the problem is to build Bitcoin. So now in this new scenario, okay, well, I want this video. So here I am on the outside of the network. Oh, check it out. There's the video. It's in the blockchain. It's in this distributed ledger that we created with Bitcoin. Well, this is fantastic. Okay. So now I just need to get access to it. And voila. Maybe I use one of the businesses that serve the content up to me directly. Maybe I connect to a miner by myself. Who knows? The entire problem is now solved. We've now created a distributed but central ledger of data that we can interact with in a way that completely changes the way the internet works. This is fantastic. It's just fantastic. And so what's important here is, well, we're on the cusp of the next industrial revolution, because you have to start realizing all of the opportunity that presents itself with the network like this. The limits, or I mean, the possibilities are pretty much limitless. Okay. And I want to reiterate this. Bitcoin isn't just money. This is what people are not understanding. If it's just money, it's not really... the only way for it to become better money is to be this inherent network that we're talking about. It's a yin and a yang. It's beautiful. Okay? And then, obviously, just to underscore, economic incentives hold all of this together. Okay? So you can't separate economic incentives from Bitcoin, like so many try to do. And there it is. So that's the presentation. I did this much better now. Well, it's actually it's apt that my screen went black for this, because this is pretty much what happened. This is pretty much what happened in Colombia. So, but I'll go back through this video. I'll edit it so that it looks much better, and you can actually see all the things that I was looking at. And so thanks for watching here. As I mentioned, I'm not going to actually be doing these as often as I used to, unless I have high quality content to do, which is more educational than like cheerleading Bitcoin SV. But there's some stuff in the works that I think you guys will appreciate. So, thank you guys very much, and have a great week.